Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are strapping in for December 2, 2025. And this was a date that felt less like a single day on the calendar and more like a multi-front assault on established norms, on laws, and frankly on the basic rules of global engagement. If you're looking for a day where executive power was tested, expanded, and then just immediately collided with constitutional limits, this was it.
It really was a fascinating and, I have to say, a terrifying snapshot. We saw these extreme political escalations, particularly surrounding the military. And at the same time, you have these urgent, undeniable global climate events just unfolding in parallel. This wasn't a slow burn. It was a flashpoint day, really, across every major geopolitical and domestic theater.
Exactly. So our mission today is to untangle this very dense stack of source material for you. We're going to distill the most important nuggets of knowledge from this incredibly busy day. And we're going to focus on three major themes. First, this existential clash over presidential war powers and military ethics. Second, the shifting, very secretive landscape of the Ukraine conflict. And then finally, some major economic and scientific milestones that, they kind of hint at where the world is heading beyond all the immediate political chaos.
The core tension of December 2nd is, I think, the rapid expansion and the testing of executive power. We saw it exemplified by these dual crises. You have the direct military actions in the Caribbean, which drew immediate scrutiny for potential war crimes. And then you have this aggressive nuclear rhetoric being tossed around by major global powers. So understanding this one day is, in a way, a shortcut to understanding how quickly fundamental legal and ethical norms can erode when high-stakes political pressure is applied.
Okay, let's unpack this immediately. I think we have to start with the most explosive topic of the day. That clash over presidential war powers and the escalating rhetoric around the war on drugs.
Right. And this really begins with an incident from back in September, but the full political and legal fallout, that really came to a head on December 2nd.
Right, so we're talking about the deadly Caribbean strike. The Trump administration has been running a very aggressive counter-narcotics campaign. They're relying heavily on naval and air power in international waters near Latin America. The controversy here is, it's chilling. The reports indicate a U.S. military aircraft carried out a second strike. It's what military personnel call a double tap.
A double tap on an already disabled alleged drug boat. Now, the initial interdiction was, perhaps standard. But the sources we have indicate that this second follow-up strike killed survivors, people who were already in the water or clinging to debris after the first attack.
And that detail, that immediately shifts the entire incident. It goes from a routine interdiction operation to a major legal and humanitarian crisis, one that, it touches on the most fundamental laws of war.
It does. And the administration had to defend this action immediately. So Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, on December 2nd, he went on television during a cabinet meeting to defend the strike. And he cited the classic defense of the fog of war.
The fog of war. So he specifically claimed he didn't see any survivors in the water.
Exactly. He claimed he didn't see anyone and suggested the second strike was necessary to ensure the vessel was completely neutralized. But, and this is the crucial part, this contrasts sharply with other internal reports. Reports that suggest military personnel were, in fact, aware that survivors were still in the water or on debris before that second strike was ordered.
And if those reports are true, that defensive fog of war it basically evaporates, doesn't it? Because fog of war implies a lack of information, a lack of visibility. If the information was available, well, then the decision becomes one of intent.
That is the absolute crux of the legal debate. The whole incident became central to questions about who ordered that double tap, what intelligence was available at the exact moment of the second strike, and, critically, how far up the chain of command did these decisions go. The administration's official line is that the Navy Vice Admiral overseeing the operation acted lawfully, but the legal abyss that opened up beneath them it's profound.
Exactly. What legal abyss are we talking about here? I think we need to define some specific terms for you listening. Human rights groups are using very, very specific terminology.
They are. We're looking at international humanitarian law, specifically the Geneva Conventions. And legal scholars are warning that if those survivors were deliberately targeted after they were already disabled and no longer posed an imminent threat, well, that strike could meet the legal definition of a war crime.
But tell us, what is the specific legal status of a survivor who's, say, clinging to a piece of debris in the ocean?
They're defined as combatants, hors de combat. It's French for out of the fight. And the principle is simple. Once an individual, even a combatant, is disabled or captured or otherwise rendered incapable of fighting, like being stranded in the water, they are legally entitled to protection. Targeting them deliberately violates one of the most fundamental norms of the laws of war. It's about distinction and humanity.
So intent is everything here.
Everything. If the intent was to eliminate survivors, it's criminal. If it was a genuine mistake under fire in the heat of the moment, it's not. The huge discrepancy in the reports makes the difference between those two scenarios absolutely critical.
And this incident had immediate political consequences, both at home and internationally.
Oh, absolutely. Allies were deeply worried about the reputational damage to U.S. forces globally, especially for those engaged in complex counter-narcotics missions that often rely on cooperation with foreign governments. And then, to add insult to injury, Hegseth's public response was just widely condemned. He released an online parody video referencing a children's cartoon in the face of these incredibly serious war crime allegations.
We're seen as flippant, right? Just profoundly disrespectful to the gravity of the situation.
Exactly. It fueled the narrative that the administration just views these rules of engagement with contempt.
So the Caribbean strike, it really sets the stage for President Trump's dramatic escalation of rhetoric on that same day, December 2nd. And this was aimed at moving the target from these non-state criminal groups, like cartels, to sovereign nations themselves.
That's the critical pivot. That's what truly alarmed international lawyers. Trump stated that any country trafficking illegal drugs into the U.S. could be attacked. Now, this isn't just a threat against cartels. This anchors a whole new aggressive doctrine of preemptive force against the infrastructure of sovereign states that are alleged to facilitate these drug networks.
And you mentioned this represents a crossing of a historical red line. We should probably explore what makes this specific leap so dangerous.
Right. Historically, U.S. anti-drug policy, it's always kind of oscillated between law enforcement and military approaches. We've supported interdiction, counter-cartel campaigns, we've trained foreign militaries. But there has always been this fundamental political and legal line between going after non-state criminal groups' cartels, organized crime, and threatening military action against sovereign states themselves. That distinction, it preserves the concept of sovereignty, which is a cornerstone of international law. Trump's new doctrine threatens to just obliterate that distinction entirely, and it could potentially justify acts of war under the banner of domestic public health.
This immediately brought the focus onto Venezuela, of course. Given the existing tensions and the perception of the Maduro regime's involvement in illicit activities. And this is where the legislative branch, this is where Congress pushed back hard.
Yes, and this is so important. The Constitution tasks Congress with declaring war. It's a power the executive branch has consistently sought to expand since really the mid-20th century. So on December 2nd, a bipartisan group of lawmakers immediately moved to reclaim that role. They cited the 1973 War Powers Resolution and announced plans to force a vote on war powers if Trump launched military action against Venezuela.
Okay, let's pause on the War Powers Resolution, the WPR.
Yeah.
For anyone listening who hasn't encountered this legal mechanism recently, what does it actually do? Why is it so potent in this specific context?
Well, the WPR was passed in 1973 over President Nixon's veto. It was a direct legislative response to the undeclared expansion of the Vietnam War, and it mandates two critical things. First, the president has to notify Congress within 48 hours of introducing U.S. armed forces into hostilities. But second, and this is the most important part, the forces must be withdrawn within 60 days unless Congress has either declared war or passed a specific authorization for the use of military force.
So the resolution would trigger an immediate congressional debate. It would require the president to seek explicit approval if any hostilities begin. And what's the fundamental fear driving these lawmakers?
The fear is mission creep. It's regional destabilization. Venezuela is a powder keg. It's grappling with economic collapse, political repression, and it's already generating the largest refugee crisis in the Western Hemisphere. Any U.S. military intervention could severely destabilize neighboring states like Colombia and Brazil. It could drag the U.S. into an open-ended confrontation with no clear exit strategy. Congress is constitutionally tasked with preventing that exact scenario. They're essentially saying, if you want to attack a sovereign state, you need to bring your evidence and your plan to us first.
And it's not just changing the U.S. constitutional balance. This external pressure is changing the dynamics inside Venezuela itself.
Absolutely. The source material notes that on that same day, December 2nd, thousands of Maduro supporters rallied in Caracas. They were rejecting what they called a slaves peace and affirming resistance against what they perceived as U.S. intervention. It just demonstrates a crucial geopolitical dynamic. Aggressive external rhetoric, even if it's aimed at regime change, often risks consolidating domestic support for the target regime. It fuels anti-U.S. sentiment and, at the end of the day, makes a diplomatic resolution far, far harder to achieve. The threat of war hardens resistance.
That sets up a major constitutional and legal test over the limits of executive power, all under the banner of counter-narcotics. But this theme of militarized governance, it didn't stop at the border. It was also felt domestically in some deeply contentious ways.
That brings us right to our next major section, these domestic flashpoints. They concern executive authority, immigration, and this profound economic anxiety.
Let's start with the militarization aspect.
Mm.
The National Guard deployment to New Orleans. On December 2nd, President Trump ordered National Guard troops to deploy there as part of a federal surge. And this coincided with a large-scale federal immigration crackdown that was dubbed Swamp Sweep.
Yeah, and this represents a really high-stakes escalation in the federal government using the military apparatus for domestic civilian law enforcement. The Guard presence is being explicitly framed as a way to back up federal immigration agents and local police during these large-scale operations. And New Orleans is an important symbol here. It's a city that has historically been the site of federal intervention, most notably during and after Hurricane Katrina. So it raises all these old concerns about precedence and overreach.
And the polarization around this is just intense. What are the key opposing viewpoints on this specific action?
Well, supporters argue it's necessary. They say it's to bolster security, to ensure comprehensive enforcement of federal immigration law, and to address crime in a city they perceive as overwhelmed. They emphasize the need for a unified federal presence to get the job done.
But the opposition has some very strong constitutional and civil rights concerns.
Absolutely. Opponents, and this includes civil rights groups, local officials, civil libertarians, they warn that militarizing enforcement, especially involving the Guard in traditional policing roles, it just risks sowing widespread fear. It could violate the civil liberties of both documented and undocumented residents, and it sets a very dangerous legal precedent. The Posse Comitatus Act generally limits the use of the military for domestic law enforcement, and while the National Guard is usually exempt when it's under state control, its deployment under federal order for this type of operation, it significantly blurs those lines. It expands federal power into areas traditionally governed by local civilian authority.
And we saw a potential model for resistance to this federal surge emerging in Minnesota, involving the large Somali community there.
Yes, Minnesota is home to one of the largest Somali diasporas in the world. And following fresh, aggressive attacks from Trump, and then subsequent fears that federal operations were imminent, state and local officials publicly defended the community on December 2nd.
And what did that defense entail specifically? What did they do?
Well, state and local leaders, they condemned the rhetoric as divisive and xenophobic. Critically, they also vowed to protect residents' civil rights and to limit cooperation with any federal enforcement operations they perceived as discriminatory. Community leaders warned that these aggressive federal actions would not only tear families apart, but also damage the essential trust that's been built between immigrant communities and local law enforcement. So Minnesota's rapid, unified response is now being watched very closely nationally as a potential blueprint for other states looking to resist this kind of federal overreach.
Okay, shifting gears slightly, but staying with executive authority. The clash extended deep into the justice system with a truly stunning move regarding presidential clemency.
This is where we see the potential for a genuine constitutional crisis. On December 2nd, President Trump declared that his administration would attempt to terminate any pardons or commutations signed by his predecessor, Joe Biden, if those clemency actions used an auto-pin system.
Wait, an auto-pin system. So Biden used an auto-pin for some clemency actions, and why would that matter legally?
Well, the source material notes that some pardons and commutations were executed using an autopin. It's essentially an automated system that applies a precise copy of a signature when the president isn't physically present. Now, courts have previously accepted autopin signatures for other official acts like signing bills into law or executive orders, but the critics, including Trump, they seized on this technicality. They tied the move to broader attacks on Biden's mental acuity and his legitimacy.
But regardless of how it was signed, the power of a presidential pardon, which is granted under Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution, it's generally considered absolute and irrevocable, isn't it?
Precisely. And that's why this raises these profound constitutional questions about the separation of powers and the finality of justice. Once a pardon or commutation is formally granted, it creates a permanent change in the legal status of the recipient. The slate is wiped clean, it's considered an irrevocable act of grace, Civil liberties advocates immediately warned that invalidating finalized pardons, even those signed by Autopen, could throw the entire justice system into absolute chaos.
And chaos meaning what? Reactivating criminal records? Or even worse, sending legally pardoned people back to prison?
Exactly that. The fear is reactivating criminal records, rescinding restored rights, and potentially forcing individuals who had moved on with their lives sometimes years prior to return to court or even to custody. Trump is trying to use one constitutional power, his executive authority, to retroactively nullify a previous lawful exercise of a different constitutional power by his predecessor. Even many conservative legal scholars express deep skepticism that a sitting president has the power to undo a predecessor's clemency actions. They stress the need for finality in judicial matters. This dispute just guarantees significant litigation, testing the constitutional stability of long-standing practices.
And the vulnerability of the domestic safety net also became another partisan football on December 2nd.
Yeah, we saw the USDA, the Department of Agriculture, warning that it could withhold SNAP, food stamp funds from certain Democratic-led states. And this was explicitly framed as an escalation of a dispute over how those states were administering the program during an ongoing federal shutdown.
So the federal department is essentially using essential aid for vulnerable families as political leverage against states they feel aren't administering the program exactly according to federal objectives.
That's how anti-hunger advocates immediately condemned it. They argued it was using vulnerable families, often the elderly, children, the disabled, as pawns in a partisan confrontation. It was deepening food insecurity during an economic crunch. And beyond the ethical concerns, it raises significant constitutional questions about federalism. Is the federal government overstepping its authority by using essential aid to enforce minor regulatory differences? Or is the executive branch simply ensuring uniform enforcement of federal law? State officials signaled they would challenge any funding cuts in court, which just highlights how programs designed to alleviate poverty become hopelessly entangled in these battles over federal power.
And on top of these executive clashes, the Supreme Court weighed in on a key post-Roe legal battle, this one with major free speech implications.
Yes, the Supreme Court agreed to hear a challenge from a faith-based anti-abortion pregnancy center. And this center is challenging a state investigation into alleged deceptive practices concerning the information they provide to patients seeking reproductive health advice.
What's the core test here for the court? What are they trying to decide?
The case tests the limits of state regulatory authority versus the First Amendment rights of free speech and religious freedom in this post-Roe landscape. States argue they have the authority to regulate potentially misleading information provided to vulnerable patients seeking health services. The center argues that the investigation itself violates its First Amendment rights by attempting to police its message, which they view as religiously and morally guided. The outcome will be critical in defining how far state can go in regulating the speech and messaging of advocacy organizations that are adjacent to the healthcare industry.
And finally, in the domestic sphere, we have the economic situation, which on December 2nd was characterized by this massive political disconnect between, Main Street and Wall Street.
A huge disconnect. We saw President Trump describing affordability concerns, the rising cost of living, as a con job. And this was happening even as private and public polling showed his economic advantage was eroding, as voters continue to struggle with the fact that wages have just not kept pace with essential prices. Rising rent, medical bills, groceries.
So while the headline economic figures, GDP growth, unemployment, they might look robust on paper, the felt reality for the majority of voters is one of persistent, painful cost pressures.
Exactly. The narrative struggle is profound. Trump supporters, they focus on stock market gains and business deregulation. But critics stress that if the cost of basic necessities outstrips wage growth, the average family feels poorer, regardless of abstract national economic indicators.
Now, this pervasive anxiety stood in really sharp contrast to the financial markets themselves on that specific day.
Oh, the irony was stark. U.S. equities rallied strongly on December 2nd. The optimism was fueled by anticipation that the Federal Reserve would cut rates at its December meeting. They were reacting to hints from Fed officials about a softer monetary stance needed to sustain growth. So you had this political anxiety over affordability clashing directly with market optimism, which was fueled by the anticipation of cheaper money.
And looking ahead, we also learned about the immediate future of the Fed's leadership, which is one of the most consequential economic appointments globally.
Yes, President Trump teased that he would announce his nominee to succeed Jerome Powell as Fed chair early in 2026. And this sets up a highly anticipated political appointment that will guide monetary policy, interest rates, and inflation targets for the next 4 years.
And beyond interest rates, we saw a significant structural trend in global capital deployment on December 2nd, this one involving one of the world's largest financial firms.
Right, we need to talk about Blackstone. The private equity giant Blackstone announced the launch of a new unit. And this unit is specifically designed to channel more retirement savings from defined contribution plans, so things like 401k, into private markets.
That sounds incredibly technical, but the implication of moving retirement money from public liquid stocks into private equity is massive. This is a potential multi-trillion-dollar shift. Why should the average listener care?
Because this is a fundamental shift in risk and transparency. Private markets, private equity, venture capital, private real estate, they're traditionally illiquid. They're only accessible to wealthy or institutional investors. They offer the potential for higher returns, sure, but they also carry much greater risk and far less regulatory oversight than publicly traded stocks.
So why are they suddenly targeting retirement savings now?
Because retirement funds, particularly defined contribution plans, they represent this massive pool of capital that's searching for yield in a world of persistent low interest rates. Firms like Blackstone see this as the last great untapped market. And while proponents argue it democratizes access to potentially higher performing assets, critics worry intensely. They worry about the growing influence of private funds, the overconcentration of systemic risk, and the fact that retirement savers might not fully appreciate that their money will be locked up for 5 to 10 years in illiquid assets. It's a huge regulatory challenge for the SEC and other regulators concerned about consumer protection and future financial stability.
That is a powerful and divided snapshot of the domestic scene. Executive overreach, constitutional chaos, and a deeply fractured economic reality. Now, let's pivot back to global tensions. I want to focus on the intensifying Ukraine conflict.
The discussions on December 2nd revealed a really complex, often secretive diplomatic push that ran parallel to severe fighting on the ground. And that created immense tension between Kyiv, Washington, and Moscow.
We're talking about the back-channel diplomacy involving highly non-traditional intermediaries. Can you detail this meeting in Moscow involving Vladimir Putin?
Yes, Russian President Vladimir Putin held talks, and they lasted over 4 hours in Moscow with informal envoys for President Trump. Those envoys were real estate developer Steve Witkoff and former White House advisor Jared Kushner. And the explicit purpose of this meeting was to discuss a possible Ukraine peace deal. It was part of a broader Trump-backed push to negotiate an end to the conflict outside of official State Department channels.
The involvement of Witkoff and Kushner, they hold no official diplomatic posts. That immediately sparked a major debate. What are the core arguments for and against using this kind of unofficial private channel?
Well, supporters argue pragmatically that unofficial channels can sometimes bypass bureaucratic deadlocks. They allow leaders to test highly sensitive political ideas like redrawing borders or setting future military limits without the immediate political backlash that comes with formal official talks. They see it as kind of risk-free brainstorming.
But the critics have some very serious fundamental concerns about transparency and legal legitimacy.
Their concerns are legion. First, critics fear this approach sidelines or actively undercuts Kyiv's official negotiating teams, potentially forcing them into accepting terms they weren't involved in drafting. Second, and more dangerously, they worry it blurs the line between public policy and private financial interests. It raises the possibility that deals could be prioritized to benefit the great powers Washington and Moscow over the sovereignty and human rights concerns of the Ukrainian state. European allies are particularly concerned that Moscow and Washington insiders are shaping European outcomes right over their heads.
Let's look at the substance of it. What were the reported Russian demands being floated during these talks?
The rumored demands are highly punitive for Ukraine, and they reflect Russia's current maximalist position. They reportedly include guarantees that Ukraine would never join NATO, strict limits on the size and capabilities of its armed forces, and, critically, full, internationally recognized Russian control over all currently occupied territories, specifically the Donbas region. Ukrainian President Zelensky publicly cautioned against these behind-the-scenes negotiations that could sacrifice Ukrainian interests for geopolitical expediency.
And adding immense immediate urgency to these opaque diplomatic efforts was the news from the battlefield itself on December 2nd.
Yes, on the same day, Russia claimed significant battlefield momentum. The Russian military leadership announced the capture of Pokrovsk, which is a key logistics hub in the Donetsk region. They also claimed control of Vovchansk in the Kharkiv region.
And if that's confirmed, what does the fall of Pokrovsk mean for Ukraine's defensive posture in the east?
Pokrovsk is critical. It's a junction point for Ukrainian supply routes and a staging area for defensive operations in the Donbass. Its loss would severely complicate Ukraine's logistics. It could potentially force commanders to consider tactical withdrawals to more defensible lines further west. This perceived momentum strengthens the Kremlin's negotiating position in those back-channel talks. It makes any discussion of territorial concessions even more alarming to Kiev, as it would be seen as rewarding military conquest achieved by force.
And these military and diplomatic tensions were compounded by a stark and, frankly, deeply irresponsible resurgence of nuclear threats on the very same day.
This was chilling rhetoric that injected existential risk right back into the global conversation. Vladimir Putin issued one of his starkest warnings to European leaders. He told them that if they want war, Russia is ready, and that any European defeat would be so total there would be no one left to negotiate. This is not casual saber rattling. This positions Russia as prepared for a catastrophic, large-scale confrontation.
And this feeds into a deeper, more worrying trend regarding the future of nuclear arms control itself.
Exactly. We noted growing concern that both the U.S. and Russia have recently threatened, rhetorically at least, to resume nuclear testing. This raises fears of unraveling the long-standing global moratorium on explosive nuclear testing. This moratorium, which has been maintained by most major powers for decades under the framework of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, even though the treaty hasn't fully entered into force, it's a cornerstone of global security.
Why is that, Norm? Even if it's based on an unratified treaty, why is it so vital to global security?
Because nuclear testing signals escalation, it signals technological advancement, and a fundamental breakdown in trust. If either major power conducts a full test, it would immediately shatter the status quo. It could trigger a cascade, encouraging other nuclear-armed states like China, India, and Pakistan, or states aspiring to nuclear weapons, to conduct their own tests. It signals that the technical and political barriers to a renewed nuclear competition are weakening, and that raises the nuclear risk profile globally.
It's a terrifying backdrop to an already complex geopolitical environment. Now let's take a necessary deep breath. I want to look at the world beyond politics, the immediate reality of the climate crisis, commerce, and scientific cures.
The contrast is striking. The contrast between the political maneuvering over war powers and the immediate harrowing humanitarian toll of these climate-driven events. December 2nd brought desperate news from Asia, where millions were facing disaster.
Starting in Sri Lanka, which faced the worst flooding in a decade.
A deadly cyclone triggered massive landslides and widespread floods, killing 410 people. The human stories are just heartbreaking. Survivors described fleeing walls of mud and water that arrived with terrifying speed. The humanitarian toll is severe, with hundreds of thousands displaced and high fears of waterborne disease outbreaks complicating the aid efforts. This disaster really intensified calls for stronger climate adaptation measures globally.
And domestically, in Sri Lanka, the disaster immediately raised questions about human decisions that might have exacerbated the natural event.
Oh, absolutely. Sources indicate that questions are being asked about land use practices. Specifically, whether rampant deforestation on hillsides in vulnerable regions may have worsened the landslides, turning heavy rain into catastrophic mud flows. There were also questions about whether the government adequately prepared for a storm whose destructive potential was forecast days in advance. It just highlights failures in infrastructure and early warning systems.
And across the Indian Ocean, Indonesia was also hit hard by the effects of this cyclone.
Yes, severe flooding struck Aceh province following continuous cyclone-driven rains. Torrents swept through villages and submerged homes, leading to widespread displacement and a mounting death toll. This just reinforces the broader need for resilient infrastructure and robust early warning systems in all these vulnerable coastal and island communities. Scientists are very clear. The increasing intensity of rainfall in this region is a direct consequence of climate change, making proactive preparation essential.
And while Asia was grappling with floods, the U.S. Northeast was hit by its own extreme winter weather event.
The Northeast experienced its first major snowstorm of the season on December 2nd. It put over 75 million people under alerts and just fundamentally disrupted post-Thanksgiving travel. The system was particularly intense because it followed an earlier weather event that caused Chicago O'Hare's highest single-day snow total since 1951, over 8 inches.
So we're seeing a pattern of these intense, volatile, disruptive storms that demand massive infrastructural responses.
Precisely. The timing and the intensity of these events have significant economic impacts. They disrupt supply chains, they halt commerce, they strain municipal budgets for snow removal and emergency response. This storm was a stark, immediate reminder of the broader need for resilient infrastructure, particularly upgraded power grids capable of handling extreme cold and heavy load, and comprehensive snow management planning in densely populated corridors like the Boston to D.C. metropolitan areas.
And the need for upgraded, stable power grids connects directly to our next topic, the future of energy and industry, which is being driven by massive technological change. This is the AI nexus.
It is. On December 2nd, the U.S. Department of Energy pledged a significant sum, up to $800 million, to support two small modular reactor, or SMR, projects. These are planned for the Tennessee Valley Authority and Holtec. This is not just a standard energy investment, it's a strategic bet on a specific type of nuclear power.
Why are SMRs suddenly so crucial now, in late 2025? What force is driving this investment specifically?
The key factor is the explosive, unprecedented growth of AI data centers, training large language models, running complex cloud computing, fueling crypto mining. All of this is driving the first significant, sustained increase in U.S. electricity demand in decades. AI requires massive, continuous 247 power, and it needs it locally, near the data centers themselves.
So explain for us how SMRs specifically address this novel demand curve better than traditional power sources like large-scale nuclear or solar and wind farms.
Well, traditional large nuclear plants are massive, they're expensive, and they take decades to permit and build. SMRs, by contrast, are compact, they're factory-built, standardized, and they're designed to be deployed much faster and closer to demand centers. They offer high-density, constant, carbon-free power. Because they're modular, they can be scaled up quickly to meet the exact huge power needs of these hyperscale AI facilities without the intermittency issues of solar and wind or the high carbon profile of natural gas. This $800 million injection is essentially the government signaling that nuclear is the necessary foundation for the AI economy.
And beyond this governmental push for nuclear, we also saw corporations responding to climate pressure. For example, BMW setting a new midterm climate goal.
Right. BMW announced a major goal to cut its total carbon dioxide equivalent emissions by at least 60 million metric tons by 2035 compared to 2019 levels. This target is ambitious, and it's fundamentally driven by vehicle electrification and tightening regulatory pressure in Europe and North America. It reflects the broader market reality that automakers must decarbonize their entire supply chains quickly to maintain competitiveness and comply with future mandates.
But not all European industry is faring so well in this transition.
No, not at all. We saw a stark contrast in the struggles of European chemical makers. According to the European Chemical Industry Council, 2025 had been a devastating down year, leading to job cuts at major firms like Wacker. This struggle is often linked to Europe's high energy prices, which are far less competitive than in the US or Asia. And that's fueling broader concerns about the long-term deindustrialization of Europe's critical energy-intensive manufacturing base.
Moving to the realm of medicine, December 2nd also brought some significant hope through major biotech advances for conditions that affect the most vulnerable.
Yes. Two major regulatory steps offered real hope for rare, often fatal diseases. First, the FDA granted breakthrough therapy designation to Ionis's zilganersen for Alexander disease.
Alexander disease is a rare, fatal neurodegenerative condition, and it typically has no effective treatment beyond supportive care. So what does the breakthrough therapy designation mean for Ionis?
It's extremely significant. It recognizes that early data suggests the therapy offers a substantial improvement over existing treatment options. The designation expedites development and review. It signals to patients and investors that this therapy is high priority and potentially life-changing.
And the second advance was in Europe.
Correct. The European Commission approved Johnson & Johnson's nipocalimab, marketed as Imabedi, for generalized myasthenia gravis, or GMG, in certain patients. This is a severe autoimmune neuromuscular disease, and nipocalimab is the first FcRn-blocking antibody approved for GMG in adults and adolescents, representing a whole new mechanism of action for treating this debilitating condition.
For families affected by these severe conditions, this news is just transformative. But what is the critical takeaway regarding the system itself, particularly around access and equity?
Well, the scientific success immediately pivots the conversation to the reality of cost. Advanced biologics and genetic therapies like these are phenomenally expensive, often hundreds of thousands of dollars per patient per year. So the success of the science now throws the spotlight onto profound ethical and economic questions of access, affordability, and how public and private insurance systems are going to manage the ballooning costs associated with these revolutionary treatments.
Looking at global governance, we should also touch on the integrity of EU institutions after a major investigation was announced.
Yes, Belgian police carried out raids on the EU's diplomatic service, the European External Action Service, and a prominent college in Bruges. This followed a fraud investigation targeting the suspected misuse of EU funds, potentially including public money intended for development projects.
That sounds like prime fuel for Eurosceptic narratives, the idea that the bureaucracy is corrupt or inefficient.
It absolutely is, and Eurosceptic leaders immediately seized on the news. However, EU officials countered that the investigation itself proves that oversight mechanisms, the checks and balances designed to police financial integrity, are working robustly. Transparency advocates are using this moment to call for broader reforms, including enhanced whistleblower protections across all EU bodies.
And speaking of Europe and governance, Canada made a strategic pivot toward European defense frameworks.
Yes, Canada announced it would join the EU-led Security Action for Europe, or SAFE, defense initiative. This is a significant geopolitical shift. And crucially, it gives Canada access to up to $170 billion in loans intended to boost defense investment and facilitate industrial cooperation with European partners.
Is this seen as a subtle distancing from the U.S., given Canada's traditional security focus on NATO and NORAD?
That's the core debate among analysts. Prime Minister Mark Carney framed it as a necessary recalibration, a move toward greater reliance on multilateral European frameworks alongside NATO and NORAD. Analysts debated whether this signaled a subtle strategic distancing from U.S. security leadership, perhaps prompted by uncertainty regarding future U.S. isolationist policy, or if it was merely a necessary diversification of alliances to ensure Canada can modernize its armed forces and industrial base effectively.
Finally, let's end this massive global overview with two powerful moments of human diplomacy and resilience in the Middle East.
The first involves the new Pope, Leo XIV, who is the first U.S.-born Pope. He was concluding his inaugural overseas trip in Lebanon, a country in desperate need of spiritual and political guidance.
He wrapped up his visit on December 2nd with a large mass and, very symbolically, a prayer at the Beirut port blast site, directly linking spiritual consolation with a call for national renewal in a country grappling with political stalemate and economic collapse.
And his core message throughout the trip was pragmatic and insistent. Dialogue is always the answer, particularly in deeply fractured societies. He urged unity across Lebanon's Christian, Sunni, Shiite, and Druze communities, underscoring the Vatican's renewed intention to be an active, nonpartisan diplomatic voice in Middle Eastern affairs under his new leadership.
And in Gaza, amidst the fragile ceasefire, we saw a powerful, poignant human symbol of resilience and the affirmation of life.
That was the mass wedding of 54 Palestinian couples in Hamad City, Khan Yunis. The celebration, which was funded by a UAE initiative, saw brides and grooms walking hand in hand through streets past collapsed and damaged buildings.
That image, it must speak volumes about the will to endure.
It was described as a profound cultural affirmation of life and continuity despite devastation. Sociologists note that Palestinian weddings often carry immense political and cultural meaning-affirming lineage, community endurance, and hope in the face of suffering. While the joy is tempered by the harsh realities of shattered infrastructure and mass displacement, the event stands as a reminder that any durable peace must address not only security and political arrangements, but also reconstruction and psychological healing.
What a truly monumental day, December 2, 2025, where the highest stakes of international law were tested against the most mundane human needs. Let's try to synthesize this before we wrap up.
I think the central theme of this day, from the military actions in the Caribbean to the clemency dispute at home, was the rapid expansion and immediate testing of executive power. And this occurred domestically through militarized immigration enforcement and the threat of using the safety net as partisan leverage, and internationally through that aggressive counter-narcotics rhetoric aimed at sovereign states.
And the immediate collision of that aggressive military action, even under the banner of counter-narcotics, with established limits and norms.
Absolutely. The double-tap strike immediately collided with constitutional limits like the War Powers Resolution, fundamental legal norms regarding combatants or to combat, and geopolitical stability, particularly regarding Venezuela. At the same time, you saw these high-stakes but often opaque efforts to contain conflicts, like the Kushner and Witkoff talks on Ukraine. All while the real-world consequences of climate change and technological shifts continue to demand massive foundational investments, such as that $800 million strategic bet on SMRs to power the AI economy.
It's a snapshot of a world that is struggling to contain its conflict and its constitutional crises,
Right.
while simultaneously having to manage unprecedented technological and climate change, and often using those crises to justify expanding presidential authority.
Indeed. It forces us to look not just at today's constitutional battles, but at tomorrow's foundational choices in infrastructure, energy, and finance, such as that massive shift of retirement capital into private markets.
Which leads us to our final provocative thought for you to mull over. Given the explosive, continuous power demand projected from artificial intelligence and the massive injection of public funds into small modular reactors, how will our foundational infrastructure decisions today on nuclear energy and resilient grids shape the balance of power between technology giants who need that constant power and government regulators a decade from now, who will ultimately control the electric foundation of the future economy?
That is a question that will undoubtedly define the next decade of governance and technology.
That's all the time we have for this edition of The Deep Dive. We thank you for joining us to untangle the complexities of December 2, 2025. We hope this knowledge serves you well.
Until next time.